Welcome to the Rap Soul Podcast, where we dive deep into the world of music that moves our hearts and gets our feet tapping. This is the intersection of rap and soul music from the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. We appreciate you for listening. Share this podcast with a friend or family member who loves music as much as you do. The podcast is hosted by 12 Kyle. Next up, the Rap Soul Podcast.
What's up, y'all? It's your boy 12 Kyle from the Rap Soul Podcast. I want to thank each and every one of you for tuning in as you do each and every week. I really do appreciate it. I also wanted to offer a programming note. This particular episode, the Rap Soul Podcast Classic, is an old episode. And for some, it may have been something that they've heard before because it was initially broadcasted on the flagship station, the 12 Kyle Podcast, back in 2016. But I wanted to give it to you guys here because the thing is that many of you didn't know my podcast existed in 2016. And the great thing about these episodes is that the information has not changed. It's not dated, and it's going to sound and feel as fresh as it did back then. So sit back and relax and check out this new episode from the Rap Soul Podcast Classic. I appreciate it. 5,000. So here we go. All Eyes on Me 20 years later. Wow. First and foremost, man, it's hard to believe that this album came out 20 years ago. What was going on back then? I think it's important to understand like where hip hop was. At that particular time, the West still had hip hop in a chokehold, we could say the West, but come on, it was really Death Row. I mean, Death Row had Snoop, they had Dre, and they had just acquired Tupac like a free agent. Tupac had just recently got out of jail. Suge Knight bailed him out of jail. I think he paid like $1.2 million to get him out of jail, and Tupac had made a pact and a pledge to Suge that he was going to basically, quote unquote, work off the debt. And he jumped in the studio, man. And one of the first things that he crafted was this album. This album is a double CD. For some of you young people who don't know what a double CD is, look it up. It's a double CD. So the album actually went diamond, 10 million copies sold. Incredible album, a West Coast staple. It was the soundtrack for the signature Death Row sound. And incredible album, man. Incredible album. Tupac. Now, some would say that I think most diehard Tupac fans will say that this probably was his best work. It's hard to disagree. It's not my personal favorite Tupac album, even though I love this album. But it is because Me Against the World is. I give Me Against the World the slightest of edges. But I love this album. Love this album. But again, it was a double CD. Tupac was coming in off the heels of leaving jail. People really didn't know, what to expect. They knew that Pac, when Pac got out of jail, man, he was full of piss and vinegar, man. He was mad. He was mad. And then, of course, you had the old East Coast, West Coast thing, which I think was made up BS, but that's another story for another day. Nonetheless, man, I mean, Pac, this album does not sound anything like, Me Against the World, but I think he had a very sharp visionary feel to this one, and then it was kind of futuristic, but it also if you look at like some of the samples that he used on the production side, and we'll talk about the production in just a second, from a production standpoint, they sampled a lot of old stuff, sampled a lot of hip-hop stuff, to be honest. But incredible album, man. I mean, Tupac, like I said, the album went diamond, critically acclaimed. I mean, from Rolling Stone to The Source gave him 5 mics, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But incredible album from front to back. So at the time in 1996, 20 years ago, Nope. First and foremost, very few artists could even pull off making a double CD, because when you make a double CD, you damn sure had better bring it. And that's what Tupac did. He got in the studio and they crafted something, I think, that was special. Unfortunately, Tupac, is no longer with us. So he never got a chance to really fully see how this album was accepted, not just in this country, but worldwide. A Tupac classic, very, very much beloved, just like he was as an artist. But in 1996, like I said, nobody was doing this kind of stuff. Nobody was doing making this kind of music. So the sound that they used, the instrumentation, I mean, with even something simple as, with Nate Dogg and the hooks and stuff like that. So it was different, man. It was different, and it was vintage Tupac. Yeah, again, I think this album, with it being a double CD, it started a trend, and I'll be the first to admit, not everybody can pull off a double CD. Not everybody can pull off a double CD because it's hard when you go and try to dig as far as your content is concerned. Most fans are used to listening to a, I don't know, 12, 13 track album. And, Pop, he kind of did a little bit of everything. I mean, he really kind of had a format on this one. He had he had a couple of club bangers with the California Love. He had he had the homies type stuff, those kind of songs, like Life Goes On. And then he had some smoothed out stuff. He had stuff with, real melodic with singing on the hooks. What was that? Thug Passion, with Jewel on the hook, and a wide range of. I think one of the things that stood out to me on this album was the production. He used everybody from Daz to Dre to Devontae Swing from Jodeci, which was crazy in and of itself. I mean, Johnny J. He had, like I said, just different producers, man. Bobcat. So, and it created a whole new different sound. This was a vintage West Coast album. It was G-Funk. It was West Coast. It was a little bit of everything, but it's still, if you kind of, like I said, if you look at the samples and some of the things some of the songs that were sampled in this, and then some of the features, you'd really be surprised, considering the fact that, a lot of people know at this particular time, Tupac was really riding for the West. So he was riding for the West, but, on a song like I Got My Mind Made Up, hey, you got Method Man on that joint. You got, Redman on the joint. So, it wasn't like he was, necessarily just bashing the East Coast. I guess he rocked with cats that rock with him. One of the things that actually stood out to me, even looking back on it and listening to it here recently, was like, I think back then I thought that Dre did a lot more on the album than he actually did. Truth be told, Dr. Dre only did 2 songs on this album. You Can't See Me, which features George Clinton, and then, of course, California Love. So, Dre is the front man and the production guy on, on Death Row at the time. But, a lot of production on this album went to Daz. And, of course, Corrupt appears on the album. Snoop, of course, Snoop's on a couple of tracks. So, it had a different feel to it. Obviously, like I said, there were some songs that were a little bit more melodic, like How Do You Want It with Casey and JoJo. Very, very hook driven. And the smash, I Ain't Mad at You, with Danny Boy on the hook, which was another one that was very, very melodic, very, at that time, nobody was really doing songs on this level with that kind of melody type stuff in the background. So, you got to give Pop his credit for having the vision to kind of take it there musically. There's no one particular format that he sticks to throughout this whole album, but the album is consistently good all the way through, which is what you can't say about a lot of albums, particularly double CD albums. So yeah, I give Tupac all the props for that. And even looking back at it 20 years later, it's 2016 now, and to know that this album dropped, and I remember the day that it came out. It was again a time where everybody had that, because it was very, very highly anticipated. Now I'm gonna just take you back to 1996. At this particular time, I was still in college, right? So I'm not, there's no internet, there's no, there's no place to go illegally download the album. I mean, you had word of mouth that the album was coming out, so I did like everybody else around my way. Went to the record store. And copped a double CD, and sat right there. I remember sitting in the parking lot, tearing off the packaging, looking at the liner notes, playing it. And again, it was a double CD, so you had to make sure that you got both CDs were in there and everything like that. And I think, at least for me, I can't speak for everybody else, but I think for me with double CDs, one CD would be more likable than the other. While I think this is an incredible album, I was a bigger fan of CD 1 than I was CD 2. And I'll read the track listing in just a second. But yeah, it was I remember it like it was yesterday, man. It was an incredible album. And to have a double CD come out at that particular time in 1996 and be it from Tupac, a guy who at that particular time, Tupac was telling people, like, I'm on death row now, I'm going to bring some heat. Obviously the album wasn't without controversy, because if you got Tupac, you're definitely going to have some controversy. So there's a lot of different things that I could talk about on this album, and I will. I'll get into it about, some of my favorite songs. One of my favorite songs is the intro, Ambitions of a Rider. I mean, that song, Tupac, one of the things that I love about listening to this album is that Pac just rides the beat. And it's kind of hard. If you're not really a music fan or a hip hop fan, you may not understand exactly what I'm talking about. But his vocal cadence rides along with the beats perfectly on this song. And I think this was a great song to start the album off with. The next song, All About You, they're talking, you got Nate Dogg on the hook. They're talking about, freaks or whatever in the videos and stuff like that. Now, I will admit this album is, it has its songs that are very misogynistic. It has its songs that are very playeristic, but that was Tupac, so if you're a fan of Tupac's, you know that you're going to get the uplifting songs. And then on the next song, he might be calling a woman a bitch. I mean, that's who Tupac was, man. Love him or hate him. And you know what? The great thing that I love about Tupac is that there was really no in between. Like you can ask anybody like what they think of Pac, and you'll never hear anybody say, he's okay. You either liked him or especially at that particular time, you either liked him or you didn't. And there was really no in between. I mean, he was who he was, but I love the fact that he stayed true to who he was, particularly on this album. So the album just keeps going. Scandalous, Got My Mind Made Up, as I mentioned earlier, was the next track. After that, How Do You Want It with Casey and JoJo. Then Two of America's Most Wanted with him and Snoop. Another banger. They dropped a video for that real cool playeristic type video. No More Pain by, like I said, was produced by Devontae Swing. Hearts of Men had a little Prince sample from Purple Rain. I like that. Life Goes On, one of those homie tracks. Only God Can Judge Me. Then it went on to Trading War Stories, California Love, I Ain't Mad at You, and then What's Your Phone Number, which featured a sample from The Time. Love that joint. Then you flip it over. If you had a tape deck, you flip the tape over, whatever like that. But in this case, we're talking CDs. So then you see the next song, the first song on the second disc was Can't See Me. Then followed by Shorty Wanna Be a Thug, Holla at Me, Wonder Why They Call You Bitch. Which the title might kind of throw you, but he's actually kind of, you know, putting it out there as to, you know, kind of uplifting the sister, asking her why she does some of the things that she does. Now that song came with some controversy because when the song dropped, the word on the street was that there's a woman singing on the hook, right? Word on the street was that that was Faith Evans at the time. Uh, I don't think that we ever could confront it. Listening to it now, it doesn't sound like Faith, but that was the word on the street, was that it was Faith. And at this particular time, something may or may not have happened between Faith and Tupac. I don't think anything ever happened between Faith and Tupac, but I cannot clearly say that nothing did or didn't happen. Nonetheless, you know about the hit 'em up. I ain't gonna get him. Anyway, so that was that song. And then When We Ride, that featured the Outlaw Immortals. Thug Passion, as I mentioned earlier, follow that up with Jewel on the Hook. Picture Me Rolling, another West Coast banger. Checkout Time, Rather Be Your No, and All Eyes on Me. Then Run the Streets, Ain't Hard to Find, and the last CD closes with Heaven Ain't Hard to Find with Danny Boy on the hook. So a lot of tracks, man. My favorite track is at least one of my favorite tracks is, you know, the crown jewel, California Love. I mean, California Love was a banger. You know it, and I know it. Hands down, one of my favorite songs on the album, the smash, California Love. You got Tupac, you got Dr. Dre, the late great Roger Troutman. I mean, what could be better? The video had the Mad Max theme. I mean, that song is a classic, man. I mean, it's a West Coast classic. I don't need to tell you anything about the song. You know exactly what I'm talking about. You know that song still rides to this day. Now, some of my other favorite tracks on the album, obviously, as I mentioned earlier, Got My Mind Made Up. Daz was on that joint. Corrupt, Meth, and Redman. Love that joint, man. The little beat was simple, but it was cool. Just real laid back. It kind of reminds me of just riding in the car with windows down, summertime, and you're banging some music, and it's just like real cool out track. No More Pain, with the kind of used the hook from Method Man. What's really, really dope, I think, about this is that I don't know what the hell Devontae Swing did to make this track. It's kind of it's kind of simplistic, but I mean, Pac gets on it, man, and he just rides on the track, man. He does, as I mentioned earlier, he rides on these tracks, man, all the way through. Obviously, like I said, California Love, Only God Can Judge Me, I Ain't Mad at You, is a classic. Not a classic as in, I Know You Got Soul or anything like that, but I think that song it resonates with people. And it talks about how, Pac is growing up and how he's maturing and doing different things or whatever like that. That's the opening verse, talking about his friend, who, has grown up and he wants to do different things. Everybody loves that. If you are a Tupac fan, you love that song. Now, if I had to pick one or two of my least favorite songs, surprisingly, and I know this is going to surprise a lot of people, very unpopular opinion, probably my least favorite song on the album, How Do You Want It? With Jodeci. I mean, Casey and JoJo. Not a fan of that song, man. And I don't know, looking back on it now, I wonder if maybe I heard the song too much or something like that. But not a fan of the song. Not a fan of the song at all. When it comes on, to be honest, I really got to be in the mood to listen to it. Because if I'm not in the mood to listen to it, I'm gonna skip it. That's a skip for me. I'm trying to think what other song. There are no other songs on this album where I say, okay, like I just don't want to hear it. But like, How Do You Want It? Yeah. And then I guess the fact that the song blew up and it was not only on hip hop stations, but R&B stations, and it had a lot of crossover appeal. And Pac, they dropped a video for it, and actually they dropped two videos for it, one regular video and an uncut video. Shout out to BET Uncut. So yeah, I'm not really feeling that song. That's probably my least favorite song on both albums. But other than that, man, this is a, now when you combine disc 1 and disc 2, it's a 2-hour joint. So you're listening to this album for 2 hours. So you really, 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 really got to be into it. But other than that, that's the only song I could say that I honestly like just skip every time. And again, I know that's not a popular opinion, but hey, it's not. Now, I mentioned earlier that it got 5 mics in the source. If I had to rate it myself, I would probably give this album 4.5 mics. Or 4.75 mic. Yeah. That's the ticket. 4.75. So not a full 5 mics, but 4.75, 4.75. And I'm gonna tell you why. This is, in my opinion, this is the best double CD to ever come out by any hip hop artist. Period. That being said, it's very hard to put together a double CD because what ends up happening is there's always some filler tracks. Now, I could probably name 3 or 4 tracks on this album, on both albums combined, that probably should have been left off the album in its totality. And then if you take those off, you pretty much have it condensed to a long, one disc album. And I'm pretty sure that if I ask you, you would probably say, oh yeah, well, they probably could take that. Like, okay, I'll give you a song. I'll give you an example. Like Run the Streets, with Michelle A, Napoleon, and Storm. Johnny J producer track. Decent. Does it make I guess the thing that I always ask myself, and I ask people, would this make just a regular album? Would it make the cut? I don't think that song makes the cut on a Tupac regular album. Just one disc album, I don't think that song makes the cut. So for the sake of having a double CD, yeah, it makes the cut, but I think it's a filler track. Nay, sue me. So I think, I think Pac probably, and I think, and maybe it's a little bit of bias, but I think because I like disc 1 better than I like disc 2, I found more filler tracks on disc 2 than I did disc 1. But again, I think just because it's a double CD, this, in my opinion, this is the best double CD from hip hop ever. I would give it 4.75 mics. Because again, I think there's just a couple of filler tracks that probably would not have normally made the album. But that being said, there's no other double CD that I would rank higher. Like Ready to Die. Life After Death. And I don't want to get into a conversation between Tupac and Biggie. I can save that for another day. But Life After Death, same thing. It's a double CD, but there are a couple of tracks on there, particularly on disc 2, where Biggie could have left them off if he just made one disc, and then it's a 5 mic album. Instead, it's 4.5. So in my opinion, again, for what it's worth, and I would ask you or anyone one of you who are listening, listen to this album, listen to the double CD, and tell me if you find any filler tracks, or any tracks that you would deem filler. Like you're like, it's okay. Here's the thing that you have to be careful with filler tracks is that this is as I mentioned earlier, it's a 2-hour album. So, unless you're riding somewhere or you're, stationary or something like that for 2 hours, you really don't need filler tracks. You're like, okay, I mean, you never want to be listening to an album and think to yourself, damn, is this almost over? So I think filler tracks do that to an album. They absolutely can kill a double CD. Um, but I still think this is the best double CD to ever come out from a hip hop artist. It's been 20 years. That is mind boggling in and of itself that this album came out 20 years ago. Now, I want to talk about the significance of this album. I think that this is one of the best albums to come out in 1996. Obviously, I think it's one of the best West Coast albums to ever come out. I think this was, Tupac's, this was his fadeaway jumper, man. This was, and again, I mentioned earlier, like, I wish he had been around to see how beloved this album was, because at this particular time, and I can't really speak for people now, but when this album dropped, like, everybody had this album. Again, for me, I was in college at the time. And when I tell you everybody on my campus at South Carolina State University had this album, like, you couldn't go anywhere without hearing a song. These songs were on the radio. And again, very radio friendly tracks. I mean, from California Love to America's Most Wanted. What was the other one that made it? How Do You Want It? All About You made it to the radio as well. And that, I don't even think that was even released as a single. Actually was released as a single. Life Goes On made it to the radio. I Ain't Mad at You was released as a single and made it to the radio. So, I mean, he really, really accomplished a lot with this album. And again, I mean, he used a lot of different people, as far as, and that's the thing, like, there was a different sound, but it was a very unique sound. I mean, because, and that showed, I think, the depth of Tupac, because he could be rhyming with Method Man and Redman on one track. The next track, he could be rapping Forte, or the Outlaws, or who else was in the album? Richie Rich or E40, so it was, Pac could get on the track with anybody, man. And I think this album really, not that Tupac's legacy needed to be solidified, but I think this album really solidified where he was and where he was going to be remembered in the game. Unfortunately, through no fault of his own, Tupac, never lived to see this album really, really blossom the way that it did. Again, it was released in February, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, he died in September of that year, 1996. So, it's tough, man. And it's tough because I understand that there is a segment of people who, didn't particularly care for Tupac at the time because of the East Coast, West Coast beef or whatever. But if you put that aside, I don't think you can front on this album. I mean, like, I would be more than happy to entertain any discussion about where this album ranks. I think it's definitely one of the best West Coast hip hop albums to ever drop. I think it's one of the best hip hop albums to ever drop. I think now, I wouldn't put this album up with like Paid in Full or anything like that, but this is a great album. And especially in 1996, this was one of the best albums to drop in 1996. So the significance of it is incredible. And I think it helped solidify Tupac's legacy, not just as a businessman, but as an MC. It helped solidify his position at Death Row. Because he was, Snoop had his thing going, Dre had his thing going, and then they bring in, like I said, Tupac was a free agent, and he was determined to be a rider for the label. It's interesting when I look at some of the players and some of the people that were used on this album, and then you kind of look at where they are now. Obviously, Tupac's no longer here. Corrupt and Daz, I guess they're still making music. I hadn't heard anything from them in a while, but I'm pretty sure they're still making music. Dre, he's a billionaire. Devontae Swing, I don't know where the hell Devontae Swing is. Last time I saw Devontae Swing, he looked pretty high. And then there's Suge Knight. I mean, what can I say about Suge? I ain't gonna say a damn thing about should have. But nonetheless, man, just wanted to take some time, man, and rap with you guys and just let you know about a album that dropped 20. And I'm pretty sure most of you are listening to this podcast saying, like, I can't believe this album dropped 20 years ago. So that's what we're going to do on this 12 Kyle podcast, man. We're going to talk about the classics. We're going to talk about 1996. This album, again, a staple for the year of 1996. All Eyes on Me, Tupac Shakur, 20 years later. That's going to do it for me. I'll holler at you guys next time. Peace.
Thank you for listening. This concludes the episode. Be sure to subscribe to the Rap Soul podcast. You can find the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Follow the podcast on social media. And feel free to continue this discussion on our Reddit page. More importantly, share this podcast with a friend or family member who loves music as much as you do. Until next time, 5,000.